Turn the lights down and get comfortable. Tonight's story begins in the dark. Before we start, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what kind of stories keep you up at night. I have worked federal land long enough to know the difference between a forest that is alive and a forest that is watching. And the night I took the North Spur assignment, I felt the second one settle in around me like a held breath. The North Spur isn't on tourist maps anymore, not because it's dangerous, but because it isn't useful. A dead-end stretch of boreal highland where the trees grow wrong and the animals avoid their own trails. And when my supervisor handed me the assignment, he didn't explain why the rotation log had 3 different names scratched out beneath it. My radio crackled as I drove in, not with static, but with a soft, rhythmic clicking, like someone tapping a pen against bone. And when I asked dispatch to confirm my channel, they paused too long before answering and told me to stay on open air and not acknowledge any incoming calls unless I could see the sender. That rule didn't exist in the manual. The tower at North Spur looked intact from a distance, but up close, the steel legs were bent inward, as if something heavy had leaned against them for a long time, and the logbook inside the ranger box ended 6 weeks ago, mid-sentence. The ink dragged into a thin line, as though the writer had been pulled away while still pressing the pen to paper. I told myself it was wildlife. Bears get curious, moose destroy everything they don't understand. But the ground around the tower showed no tracks, not even mine once I stepped away, the soil smooth and dark, like it had been combed flat. As dusk fell, the forest began to hum, not insects, not wind, but a low vibration I felt behind my eyes, and my radio clicked again, once, twice, 3 times, matching the pulse in my skull. A voice came through then, clear and close, using my name with the casual confidence of someone who had said it many times before, telling me I'd parked in the wrong place and that it would find me faster now. I should have left. Every survival instinct screamed to turn the engine over and drive until the road reappeared on the map. But when I looked back at my truck, the headlights were on, illuminating the tower wall. And in that white glare, I saw handprints appear one by one on the steel, pressing from the inside out, stretching the metal as if the structure itself were soft. The radio clicked again, and the voice laughed, and somewhere deep beneath the ground, something vast shifted, aligning itself with where I stood, like a compass needle finally finding north. I backed away from the tower without turning my back to it, every step deliberate, the way they teach you when dealing with large predators, though nothing in my training covered steel flexing like skin, or voices that knew where you slept as a child. The handprints faded as soon as the light moved off them, leaving the metal smooth again, undamaged, like the tower was correcting itself. And when I keyed my radio to call dispatch, my transmission light came on, but my voice didn't echo back, the silence swallowing it whole. The forest dimmed as night finished settling, the sky turning that bruised indigo color that means no moon is coming. And that's when I realized the sound wasn't everywhere anymore. It was directional, pulling my attention down slope toward the old service road that hadn't been used since before I was born. I told myself to mark the anomaly, take photos, retreat. But my phone camera refused to focus on anything past the beam of my flashlight, the edges of the image blurring into streaks like the world didn't want to be documented. I started walking, not because I wanted to, but because standing still felt like consent, and the road appeared exactly where the map said it wouldn't be, freshly cleared, the dirt darker than it should have been, warm under my boots as if heat was bleeding up from something buried. My radio clicked again, once for yes, twice for no, 3 times for I am close, and when I whispered stop into the mic, it responded with a single click, patient, amused. Halfway down the road, I found a ranger marker nailed to a tree, the reflective paint still bright, stamped with a number that didn't exist in our system. And beneath it, someone had carved a warning so shallow it could only be seen at the right angle. Do not follow the echo. I laughed then, a short, sharp sound I couldn't stop, because fear does that to you when it doesn't know where to go. And the forest laughed back, not in sound, but in motion, branches swaying without wind, shadows bending the wrong way. My headlamp caught movement ahead, something tall crossing the road in 2 steps, too smooth, too precise. And when I froze, it froze too, the silhouette cutting itself into pieces behind the trees so I could never see its full shape. The voice came back on the radio, softer now, almost kind, telling me it was impressed I hadn't run, that the others always did, that running made the road longer. I asked what it was, because asking felt safer than listening, and it answered by naming every place I'd ever worked, every trail I'd ever walked, including one closed before I joined the service. And when it finished listing them, it said North Spur wasn't a location, it was a process, and I was already inside it.
I stopped counting my steps when the numbers stopped making sense, when the road bent back on itself in ways that shouldn't be possible without elevation changes the land simply didn't have, and my compass spun like it was trying to drill its way out of my hand. The humming resolved into layers then, stacked frequencies that made my teeth ache, and I realized with a slow, creeping dread that the sound wasn't coming from the forest around me, it was passing through it, using the trees the way a throat uses vocal cords. I tried to ground myself the way instructors teach during disorientation drills. Name 5 things you can see, 4 you can touch, 3 you can hear, but every category overlapped until nothing felt distinct anymore. The road breathing faintly under my boots, the air thick enough to resist my lungs. My radio clicked once, then once again, then 3 times in quick succession, excited now, and the voice returned, explaining that North Spur existed anywhere attention lingered too long, that it had been a migration route before it was a road, before it was even land, and that rangers were ideal because we stayed, we listened, we documented. I reached a clearing that hadn't been there moments before, a perfect oval stamped into the trees, and in the center stood a structure I couldn't identify. Not a building, not a machine, something assembled according to rules I didn't have words for. Surfaces folding into themselves, casting shadows that pointed inward. The air smelled clean there, sterile, like rain filtered through metal, and my radio fell silent, the hum cutting out so abruptly my ears rang. I should have felt relief, but the quiet felt worse, like the moment a crowd stops talking all at once. As I stepped closer, the structure reacted, not moving, but acknowledging me, lights blooming along its edges in a pattern that made my vision swim. And I understood without being told that it had been waiting for someone who could recognize boundaries. Images flooded my mind then, not memories, but records, moments from different times layered together, rangers standing where I stood, surveyors before them, loggers, hunters, people who had followed something subtle off the map and never returned, their curiosity folded neatly into the place itself. The voice came back, not through the radio this time, but through the structure, through the ground, through me, explaining that it wasn't hunting, it was cataloging, that the forest wasn't alive in the way we meant it, but it was functional, a containment field stretched thin by centuries of observation. I felt something brush against my thoughts, gentle, precise, measuring my fear like data, and I knew then that leaving wasn't prohibited, it was simply unrecorded, and unrecorded things were unstable. The structure pulsed once, a signal sent outward, and far away I heard engines, radios, boots on gravel, the system correcting for my presence, bringing witnesses, because one was never enough.
The engines I heard weren't approaching from any direction I could place, the sound flattening itself so distance stopped meaning anything, and I realized the clearing wasn't a destination, but a node, a place where paths overlapped without touching. The structure dimmed as the noise grew louder, as if conserving attention, and the forest around the oval leaned inward, trees bending just enough to remind me they could bend further if asked. My radio sparked back to life on its own, dispatch calling my unit number with professional calm, asking me to confirm my location for the third time, their voices stacked slightly out of sync like a recording played through warped tape. I didn't answer. The voice from the place, the thing that wasn't hunting, told me that response would collapse the distinction between observer and observed, that the others had learned this too late, that silence was the only form of movement that didn't leave a trace. Headlights flared at the edge of the clearing, then faded, then reappeared closer without crossing the space between, and I saw silhouettes of trucks that looked correct until you focused on them, their proportions subtly wrong, doors opening the wrong way, light spilling out at angles that didn't match the terrain. Figures stepped out wearing ranger green, reflective patches catching my lamp, and for a moment hope punched through my chest so hard it hurt, until one of them lifted a hand and it bent backward at the wrist, waving with emotion I'd never seen a human make. The structure brightened in response, patterns shifting faster now, and I understood it was recording the interaction, cataloging error margins, adjusting. The voice told me this was why North Spur reset, why reports contradicted each other, why maps never stayed updated, because reality here wasn't broken, it was iterative. One of the figures called my name, perfectly, warmly, using the tone supervisors use when they're trying to keep you calm after an incident. And when I met its gaze, I saw my own eyes looking back, not mirrored but delayed, like it was waiting for me to finish a thought before continuing it. Panic finally broke through discipline then, raw and animal, and I bolted sideways out of the clearing, choosing motion over correctness, crashing through brush that resisted like muscle. The hum roared back instantly, angry now, and the road reappeared beneath my feet without warning, throwing me forward, my radio skidding across the dirt ahead of me and stopping on its own, upright, antenna pointed at the sky. It clicked 3 times, then once again, the voice no longer calm, telling me deviation increased cost, that I was damaging the set, that witnesses were expensive. I snatched the radio up, and for the first time since arriving, I shouted into it, not for help but for interference, screaming numbers, locations, anything to flood the channel. And somewhere behind me, the forest convulsed, trees shuddering as if a massive hand had lost its grip. The road split ahead into paths that hadn't existed before, and I understood with brutal clarity that North Spur wasn't trying to stop me anymore. It was trying to see which version of me would survive. I took the left path because it felt wrong, because every instinct I had said the right one was safer, wider, more familiar, and North Spur had already proven it knew how to use familiarity like a snare. The moment my boots crossed onto it, the hum shifted pitch, not louder or quieter, but sharper, like a blade sliding between frequencies, and the forest behind me blurred, details smearing as if someone had dragged a wet thumb across reality. My breathing sounded delayed in my own ears, each inhale arriving a fraction of a second after my chest expanded. And I realized time here wasn't breaking, it was desynchronizing, layers slipping out of alignment. The path narrowed quickly, trees growing so close their branches brushed my shoulders, and every touch sent a vibration through my body that didn't belong to my nerves. My radio stayed silent, which scared me more than the voice ever had, and when I glanced back, I saw the clearing collapse in on itself, the oval shrinking until it snapped shut like an eye blinking. Ahead, the path ended abruptly at a river that hadn't been on any map, its surface unnaturally smooth, reflecting the forest not as it was, but as it had been, younger, denser, untouched by roads or towers. Shapes moved beneath the water, slow and deliberate, following the current upstream instead of down. And when I stepped closer, the reflection shifted to show me standing there with company, figures at my sides I couldn't feel. The voice returned, distant now, stretched thin, explaining that water was a boundary it struggled to maintain, that reflections were records too, and records could be edited. The river spoke then, not in words but in pressure, a pull behind my eyes that showed me glimpses of exits that led nowhere and nowhere that led out. And I understood that crossing wasn't about distance, it was about version control. I waded in before I could lose my nerve, the water ice cold and heavy, dragging at my legs like it was reluctant to let go of what it already knew. And halfway across, the hum cut out entirely. Silence slammed into me, absolute, the kind that makes you aware of your own heartbeat as a foreign object. And when I looked up, the forest on the far bank looked wrong in a new way, too still, too complete, like a photograph waiting for someone to step into frame. I reached the opposite shore and pulled myself out, soaked and shaking, and that's when I saw the ranger marker hammered into a tree there, the same impossible number as before, only this one had been freshly painted. Beneath it, carved deeper this time, were words that hadn't been there before. You are the echo now. Behind me, the river began to ripple, the smooth surface fracturing as something adjusted its record, and far away I heard my own voice calling my name from the path I'd abandoned.
I took the left path because it felt wrong, because every instinct I had said the right one was safer, wider, more familiar, and North Spur had already proven it knew how to use familiarity like a snare. The moment my boots crossed onto it, the hum shifted pitch, not louder or quieter, but sharper, like a blade sliding between frequencies, and the forest behind me blurred, details smearing as if someone had dragged a wet thumb across reality. My breathing sounded delayed in my own ears, each inhale arriving a fraction of a second after my chest expanded, and I realized time here wasn't breaking, it was desynchronizing, layers slipping out of alignment. The path narrowed quickly, trees growing so close their branches brushed my shoulders, and every touch sent a vibration through my body that didn't belong to my nerves. My radio stayed silent, which scared me more than the voice ever had, and when I glanced back, I saw the clearing collapse in on itself, the oval shrinking until it snapped shut like an eye blinking. Ahead, the path ended abruptly at a river that hadn't been on any map, its surface unnaturally smooth, reflecting the forest not as it was, but as it had been, younger, denser, untouched by roads or towers. Shapes moved beneath the water, slow and deliberate, following the current upstream instead of down, and when I stepped closer, the reflection shifted to show me standing there with company, figures at my sides I couldn't feel. The voice returned, distant now, stretched thin, explaining that water was a boundary it struggled to maintain, that reflections were records too, and records could be edited. The river spoke then, not in words but in pressure, a pull behind my eyes that showed me glimpses of exits that led nowhere and nowhere that led out, and I understood that crossing wasn't about distance, it was about version control. I waded in before I could lose my nerve, the water ice cold and heavy, dragging at my legs like it was reluctant to let go of what it already knew, and halfway across, the hum cut out entirely. Silence slammed into me, absolute, the kind that makes you aware of your own heartbeat as a foreign object, and when I looked up, the forest on the far bank looked wrong in a new way, too still, too complete, like a photograph waiting for someone to step into frame. I reached the opposite shore and pulled myself out, soaked and shaking, and that's when I saw the ranger marker hammered into a tree there, the same impossible number as before, only this one had been freshly painted. Beneath it, carved deeper this time, were words that hadn't been there before. You are the echo now. Behind me, the
The river began to ripple, the smooth surface fracturing as something adjusted its record, and far away I heard my own voice calling my name from the path I'd abandoned.
I didn't sleep, not really, but time advanced anyway, the way it does when something else is in charge of the clock, and the forest shifted from night to a gray false dawn without ever giving me darkness to rest in. My clothes dried on my body without warmth, stiffening like they'd been cured rather than dried, and when I finally moved again, my joints protested as if I'd been standing still for days. The truck was still there when I reached it, exactly where I'd seen it from the ridge, parked wrong, angled toward trees instead of the road, and the sight of it filled me with a sudden irrational dread, like seeing your own handwriting on a note you don't remember writing. The doors were unlocked. Inside, everything was normal at first glance, pack, water, logs, until I noticed the mileage counter ticking upward even with the engine off, numbers climbing steadily as if the truck were driving somewhere without moving. I shut it down by instinct, slamming my palm against the dash, and the ticking stopped immediately, replaced by a faint breathing sound that took me a moment too long to realize wasn't mine. I backed out slowly, keeping my eyes on the cab, and that's when I saw footprints forming in the frost around the vehicle, bare feet, elongated, toes pressed too deep, circling the truck with careful interest. The hum returned, lower now, buried under something organic, and a new sound layered over it, wet and rhythmic, like skin stretching and relaxing. From the tree line came a figure that looked human at first, wrapped in the suggestion of ranger green, posture slightly wrong, shoulders set too far back, head tilting as if it were trying to remember how gravity worked. It opened its mouth and spoke my name with my own voice, but the timing was off, syllables arriving late, dragged through a throat that wasn't shaped for them. The system voice didn't speak then, it listened. I understood with cold clarity that this thing wasn't part of North Spur's original structure. It was something older, opportunistic, a mimic that had learned to wear the recordings left behind. And the forest tolerated it the way an ecosystem tolerates a scavenger. The figure stepped closer, its face resolving and unresolving, features sliding like they were being chosen from a limited set, and I forced myself not to answer, not even to think in words it could borrow. The footprints stopped inches from my boots. The thing leaned in, sniffing, and I felt it searching for seams, for habits, for memories it could put on like a uniform. Somewhere deep beneath us, the forest adjusted, recalculating, allowing the encounter because it wanted to see the outcome. I reached slowly for my radio, not to call for help, but to create noise, interference, something unpatterned. And as my fingers closed around it, the mimic flinched, its borrowed face tightening with something like annoyance. It stepped back into the trees reluctantly, dissolving into motion and shadow, but I knew it hadn't left, only repositioned, patient, waiting for me to make a mistake. The radio crackled once, softly, and the system voice returned, quieter than ever, telling me anomalies were inevitable, that some echoes learned to walk, and that survival here wasn't about escape, it was about not being the most interesting thing in the forest.
The false dawn shifted into a noon that didn't feel like day. Sunlight filtered through the treetops in muted slabs, casting shadows that didn't match anything on the ground, and the forest around me hummed in quiet anticipation, like it had been waiting all along for me to move. The mimic, or the skinwalker, as my mind finally settled on calling it, wasn't visible, but the footprints remained, looping in impossible arcs, crossing over themselves without intersecting, proof it had been everywhere at once. I tried to force rationality. Predators leave prints, humans leave prints, but nothing should leave prints that bend physics, and yet here they were. My radio remained my only lifeline, my only interface with what little structure North Spur still offered, but even it had begun to hesitate, clicking faintly, distorting, repeating syllables from messages I hadn't sent. As I moved along the riverbank, the water mirrored me again, but the reflection was wrong. The mimic was there, just behind me in the mirrored world, every movement of its head perfectly offset, like it was learning from my hesitation. I spoke aloud, testing it, calling out my own name, and the reflection repeated my words, slower, distorted, with a whisper that wasn't mine layered beneath. I tried to turn, and the forest bent, trees warping, shadows reaching, funneling me toward a narrow passage that led uphill. The voice returned on the radio, quiet, almost conspiratorial, telling me I was learning too quickly, that mirrors were unstable, that some predators had patience beyond reckoning. I climbed the ridge, sweat and cold mixing, lungs burning, heart thrumming like it wanted to escape my chest, and at the top I saw a structure too large to be fully comprehended at first, stretching along the ridge like a fallen vessel made of black wood and steel, trees fused into its sides, snow piled on unevenly. Shapes moved within, flickering between human and impossible angles, and my mind tried to assign names, mimic, echo, ranger, observer, but the system voice interrupted with a gentle correction. It is all you. It has always been you. You have always been it. Panic surged, a primal surge that cut through the cold fog in my head, and I started running again, not along the trail, but straight at the structure, hoping for confrontation, escape, understanding. The mimic emerged then, stepping from the shadows of trees I hadn't noticed before, exactly my height, exactly my build, wearing my gear, copying my gait, even my breath, and the forest held its breath as we met halfway. I froze, unable to decide whether to attack, flee, or reason, and the radio buzzed once more, weakly, voice saying softly, "Observation complete. Integration pending." The skinwalker tilted its head at me, patience infinite, waiting for the choice I couldn't make. And somewhere deep beneath the ridge, I felt the forest pulse, ready to fold the next version of North Spur into itself, leaving only echoes of me behind.
I made the choice without realizing it was one, stepping sideways instead of forward or back, breaking symmetry. And the moment I did, the forest reacted like a misfired equation, the hum spiking, the structure along the ridge shuddering as if recalculating a variable it hadn't planned for. The skinwalker hesitated for the first time, its mimicry stuttering, my face slipping half a second out of alignment with its own. And in that gap, I saw what it really was, not a creature wearing me, but a collection of approximations stitched together by observation, habits layered on habits until something almost human emerged. The system voice surged, sharper now, warning that lateral deviation increased instability, that I was creating noise, and I realized noise was the only thing it couldn't easily catalog. I slammed my radio against a rock, not hard enough to destroy it, just enough to crack the casing, and the feedback that erupted wasn't static, but a screaming cascade of half-formed transmissions, ranger calls, weather reports, distress signals, overlapping until they dissolved into raw sound. The forest recoiled, trees bent away from me, shadows tearing loose from their anchors, and the skinwalker staggered, clutching its head like the noise was scraping something vital out of it. It opened its mouth and tried to speak, but the voice that came out wasn't mine anymore. It was many voices at once, rangers, hikers, surveyors, all pleading, all unfinished. I ran then, not toward the structure, not toward the truck, but downhill into terrain that felt unimportant, unobserved, the kind of place no one ever stopped to look at twice. Behind me, the ridge folded, the massive shape along it collapsing inward like a thought being suppressed, and the hum fractured into broken rhythms that chased me through the trees. I didn't look back when I heard footsteps matching mine, perfectly synced, because I knew that was how it learned, through comparison, and instead I focused on doing things wrong, tripping deliberately, changing pace erratically, shouting nonsense into the forest, anything to corrupt the record. The radio in my hand sparked and died, its screen going dark, and with it the system voice vanished, leaving only the sound of my own breath and the skinwalker's imitation falling increasingly out of sync. Eventually, the footsteps stopped. The forest stopped reacting. I collapsed against a tree, lungs burning, and waited for something to correct me, to pull me back into the process, but nothing came. When I finally dared to look up, the trees looked like trees again, imperfect, asymmetrical, real. In the dirt nearby, a single footprint remained, neither fully human nor fully animal, already softening at the edges, erasing itself. I stayed there until real dusk arrived, until the light faded honestly, and when I stood, I knew with a quiet certainty that North Spur hadn't lost me, it had let me go, because I was no longer useful as an observer. As I walked away, deeper into land that existed on maps again, I understood the worst part wasn't that the forest watched us, but that sometimes it learned, and sometimes it decided it didn't need to keep everything it studied.
I thought I had escaped, that the forest had released me like a faulty experiment. But walking back to familiar trails felt wrong, as if every step I took bent reality slightly, leaving impressions that no one else would see, but which I could feel pressing on my bones. The trees along the edges of the path leaned closer than they should, shadows stretching longer than light allowed, and I realized the mimic hadn't left. It had simply stepped back into the layers I couldn't perceive, waiting for the moment I became careless. My radio stayed dead, the hum gone, replaced by an eerie silence so complete I could hear the flow of sap in the nearest birch, the subtle grinding of roots shifting under frost. The further I went, the more I noticed things that were off, rocks arranged like markers, branches tied together in impossible knots, depressions in the soil that looked like footprints but led nowhere. Each anomaly was subtle, almost forgettable, but my mind cataloged them with a compulsive precision I couldn't shake. I tried to speak aloud, tell myself it was over, but even my words felt borrowed, as though the forest had been listening so long it knew how to anticipate them, twisting meaning before it reached my ears. At the next ridge, I saw movement in the tree line, not close enough to identify, but deliberate, calculating. The skinwalker, or one like it, emerged slowly, keeping just outside my vision, a shadow that bent correctly into the world, but whose details never fully resolved. It mimicked my breathing, my pace, the subtle tilt of my shoulders, the way I adjusted my backpack, and I realized that even though I had outrun the larger system, I was still being studied, still being tested. I made a choice then, a conscious decision to keep walking, to refuse observation, to deny it the satisfaction of an echo I could recognize. And yet, as I descended toward the lower forest, toward land that felt ordinary, my peripheral vision caught glimpses of impossible shapes, subtle distortions in tree bark, reflections in puddles that weren't mine, and I understood that North Spur didn't let go so easily. It waits, it folds timelines, bends perception, catalogs mistakes, and sometimes leaves reminders, the skinwalker, a footprint, a whisper, a flash of light in the corner of your eye. I keep moving, counting each step, careful never to repeat a pattern, aware that somewhere behind me, in layers I cannot perceive, it is learning, waiting for a moment when curiosity or fatigue will make me human again, when the forest can reclaim what I foolishly thought I had escaped. And even now, when the world feels normal, I hear it occasionally, a soft click in the distance, a mimic of my own voice calling me, reminding me that some echoes never truly fade.
I forced myself to keep walking,
deeper into terrain I recognized as belonging to no known trail, yet strangely familiar in ways my mind couldn't reconcile. The forest around me began to warp subtly again, not violently, but enough that straight lines became crooked, shadows shifted while I wasn't looking, and leaves whispered in a language I almost understood. I felt the skinwalker before I saw it, a presence stretching just beyond perception, timing its movements with mine, a predator of patterns rather than flesh. I tried to reason with it, tried to convince myself it wasn't real, that my imagination had been corrupted by days of disorientation, but every instinct screamed otherwise. My breath fogged in the cold air, each exhale like a flag waving in a storm I couldn't see, and the hum of North Spur returned faintly, threaded into the wind, shaping the way I heard everything, the snap of a twig, the shuffle of soil, the distant fall of snow from branches. I rounded a bend in the path and saw a figure standing perfectly still, waiting. At first I thought it was a ranger, but the posture was wrong, too symmetrical, movements too precise. Then I recognized myself, mirrored exactly, down to the smallest detail, and I knew without being told that this was what the skinwalker had become. Me, rehearsed, anticipating, recording every choice. The forest leaned closer, thickened, alive in ways it hadn't been before, and I realized that the mimic had integrated with the system, a node within North Spur itself. I understood that leaving meant more than walking away. It meant abandoning the echo it had created, leaving it free to step into other versions of me in ways I couldn't foresee. I considered running, but every path now led to the same mirrored encounters, the same subtle distortions, and I understood that physical escape was meaningless. My only option was interaction, misdirection, improvisation, anomaly. I began to move in ways unpredictable, speaking nonsense aloud, stepping off the path, retracing steps, and the mirrored figure hesitated for the first time, tilting its head, confused. The forest pulsed, adjusting, rebalancing, and I realized that the mimic had limits. It could imitate patterns, replicate habits, but it could not create chaos. I pressed forward, breaking my routines, breaking my instincts, filling the environment with untraceable errors, and with each misstep, I felt the pulse of the forest weaken, the mirrored figure faltering, the path finally yielding space I could occupy alone. For a fleeting moment, the system seemed to pause, letting me breathe, letting me believe I was free, and yet I knew that freedom was temporary. North Spur waits, it watches, it catalogs, and the skinwalker remains, always just beyond sight, ready to step in whenever I slip, whenever my patterns align, whenever curiosity makes me human again.
I could feel it then, the full weight of North Spur pressing down, the forest alive in a way that went beyond movement or sound, aware not only of me, but of every impulse I had, every thought I tried to hide, every heartbeat I couldn't control. The skinwalker stepped from the shadows at last, perfectly formed as me, a reflection made flesh, eyes glinting with a cold, patient intelligence, and I realized the final test had begun. It didn't run, it didn't attack, it waited, tilting its head in perfect imitation of curiosity, and I understood that any predictable motion would be cataloged, any mistake recorded and turned against me. I began to speak aloud, narrating my movements, describing my thoughts, saying things that didn't make sense, deliberately breaking every pattern, improvising in ways that no ranger could train for. The forest pulsed, the trees bending, the shadows stretching, the snow cracking beneath invisible weight,
and the skinwalker faltered, its expression twitching as though it could not compute my unpredictability. I ran then, but not toward the ridge, not toward any landmark, just running randomly, weaving through the trees in arcs and loops that contradicted logic, talking nonsense, jumping over rocks, and when I tripped, I rolled, fell, spun, creating chaos for it to observe, refusing to submit to its learning. Behind me, I heard the soft, uneven steps of the mimic, the echoes of my own movements mirrored imperfectly, and the forest hummed with frustration, bending paths and displacing light as it tried to recalculate. I forced myself to laugh, a sharp, unrecognizable sound, and the mirrored figure recoiled as though my voice was an attack, its calm imitation breaking down under irregularity. For the first time since arriving at North Spur, I felt a sliver of power, not over the forest, not over the mimic, but over the system's ability to predict me. I kept moving, deliberately unpatterned, leaving no trail the forest could follow, refusing to occupy the spaces it expected. And I realized then that my survival didn't depend on defeating the skinwalker, or escaping the forest, or even outrunning the system. Survival depended on being unrecognizable, being unpredictable, being an anomaly that couldn't be recorded, cataloged, or mirrored. The snow shifted underfoot, the trees leaned and released, and I ran into the gray light of dusk, alone, yet knowing that somewhere behind me, in layers of reality I could not see, the skinwalker and North Spur recalculated, patient, waiting, learning, and I understood that freedom here was a negotiation, temporary and fragile, held only by the chaotic choices I could force myself to make.
I reached the edge of the mapped forest just as real night began to fall. The stars above, sharp and cold, familiar constellations I could trust. And for the first time since arriving at North Spur, I felt the weight lift slightly, though not completely. The snow beneath my boots was uneven, natural, unshaped, and the trees no longer leaned or whispered my movements, yet the memory of their awareness clung to me like a second skin. I dared a glance behind, and though the forest appeared ordinary, perfectly still, I knew better. The mimic, the skinwalker, the system itself, all of it lingered, embedded in layers I could not perceive, waiting for the next observer to stumble, waiting for me to slip into a predictable pattern. I didn't speak of it at first, not because I wanted to, but because no one would understand, because describing the forest's attention, the way it could record and replicate, would sound like madness. I returned to my truck, found it exactly where it should be, and drove away. Road beneath tires solid, real, unmoving, yet every mile carried the echo of North Spur in the way the world felt slightly off, slightly too quiet. Over the next days, I tried to resume life as a ranger, documenting trails, inspecting towers, listening to radios, but sometimes I caught myself staring too long at a reflection in a window, a mirror, a puddle, wondering if a version of me waited inside, watching, cataloging, learning. Sometimes I hear the faint hum in quiet moments or a soft click behind me, and I know that freedom is temporary, fragile, negotiated through chaos and unpredictability. North Spur has released me physically, but not fully. It leaves reminders, subtle tests, an eternal presence that will follow me, shaping perception, teaching patience, ensuring that the next time I or anyone else encounters it, we are never truly alone. I survived, but I am changed. Every shadow, every reflection, every slight displacement of sound carries the lesson North Spur taught me. Observation is power, and being watched is not the worst part. The worst part is knowing you can never truly leave, that a fragment of you, perfectly mirrored, may always remain behind, patient, waiting, learning. The forest exists still, breathing, cataloging,